Each theory presented was less an explanation than a confessional, a window into the personal beliefs and hidden fears of those who spoke. Miss Marple, ever the observer, listened in silence, offering nothing in return but her quiet presence. She watched for the subtle cues, the glances that lingered too long, the smoothness of an alibi that felt too rehearsed, the flicker of relief in someone's eyes when attention was diverted from them. It was these small human details that always spoke louder than words, and Miss Marple knew that the answers she sought lay not in the arguments that raged around her, but in the quiet, hidden moments of truth that only she would notice. As the others continued to argue, Miss Marple set about her quiet task of reconstruction. She didn't rely on magnifying glasses or notebooks. She relied on her memory. She retraced the movements of each guest the night before, piecing together the fragments of their actions, the way they had behaved, the things they had said or not said. In her mind, the puzzle began to take shape, and she knew that the key to unraveling this mystery lay not in the grand gestures of accusation, but in the subtle, often overlooked details that others would miss. The past was always a silent witness, waiting for the moment when its truth would finally emerge, and Miss Marple, with her sharp, unassuming eye, was ready to listen. Miss Marple's mind worked with quiet precision as she retraced the steps of the evening, piecing together the subtle details no one else seemed to notice. She thought back to who had excused themselves too quickly, who had lingered when they had no reason to, and who had been quick to offer an alibi before anyone had even asked. Lady Camilla had retired first, her nerves worn thin, clearly unsettled by the events that had unfolded. Lydia, her uncertainty palpable, had followed her, her gaze flickering back toward the missing Sapphire one last time, as if unwilling to fully let go of the thing that had caused so much chaos. Colonel Braithwaite, on the other hand, had remained by the fire, speaking too loudly of family honor and responsibility, though his words felt more like an attempt to drown out his own mounting guilt. His wife had been conspicuously absent during this exchange, only returning when her absence had become too noticeable to ignore. Then somewhere between the last glass of port and the first scream of morning, someone had quietly crept back into the drawing room, unlocked the display case, and stolen the ring. It was clear enough how it had been done, but Miss Marple was already far ahead, instinctively sensing that the true motive had little to do with greed. She suspected that it was driven by something far darker, fear. Fear of a truth too terrible to bear. It was Colonel Braithwaite's offhand remark that had triggered Miss Marple's memory. Over breakfast he muttered about the creaky floors in the house, remarking how he had heard someone pacing throughout the night. A seemingly trivial comment, but one that fell into place with startling clarity in Miss Marple's mind. She recalled Lydia's restless walk, how her footsteps had faltered just near the attic stairs, and Mrs. Braithwaite's return to the drawing room, her shoes leaving faint damp impressions on the hearth rug. Curious, considering the evening had been dry. One creaky floorboard, one misplaced step, a moment of hesitation caught between guilt and fear. It wasn't proof, not yet, but Miss Marple knew better than most that the most telling clues are often those that people never intend to reveal. The sapphire had disappeared, yes, but Miss Marple was already seeing the bigger picture. The true story wasn't about the ring itself, but about who had touched it last, and what secret they had hoped to bury alongside it. It was a game of deception, and someone in that room had been desperate enough to risk it all. After breakfast, Miss Marple carefully tied her scarf and stepped outside, declining Lydia's polite offer to accompany her. Fresh air, she explained, was what she needed, but her true purpose was far more deliberate. In every village, Miss Marple knew, there was no better source of truth than the local gossip, its tendrils winding through every conversation, every whispered exchange. And today, she was going to listen carefully to what the village could tell her. The village's gossip network was a finely spun web, a tapestry of whispers that moved faster than the wind, and always seemed to find their way into the corners of every conversation. From the grocer's counter to the post office hatch, and even to the weather-beaten bench in the churchyard where old secrets were often traded like currency, the town's secrets rarely stayed buried for long. Miss Marple moved unhurriedly through the village, pausing as if casually admiring a particularly unruly rose bush, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. She had long perfected the art of appearing harmless, an elderly woman with no obvious purpose other than her gentle presence. In truth, it was this very appearance of innocence that made people forget their manners. People would share things with her, things they would never dream of admitting to the police. At the village shop, where gossip was as much a currency as flour and tea, Miss Marple lingered just long enough to become part of the background, as unremarkable as the jar of barley sugar she picked up. But the chatter was as constant as the ticking of a clock, and she listened closely. "Oh, it's back, is it?" Mrs. Combs remarked solemnly, weighing out tea leaves like a coroner performing an autopsy. "That's Sapphire's curse, it always has been. Didn't I tell you, Elsie? After what happened to Violet Greville?" Miss Marple's eyebrows arched slightly, the faintest of movements, but it was enough. Violet Greville. Her name had drifted through the house like smoke, but no one had dared speak it so casually. The story that followed flowed effortlessly, as if the floodgates had been opened after years of being locked. It was a story of an old feud, of a broken engagement, of a missing heirloom, and most tantalizing of all, a letter destroyed in a fit of anger. Greystone Hall, the grand house at the edge of the village, had been the epicenter of this drama, and the villagers had split into quiet factions, each one holding on to accusations too scandalous to speak aloud, but too delicious to forget. Yet, within the house itself, no one had dared to speak of these things, as if the very mention of them might summon something dark and dangerous. But outside, among the quiet corners of the village, the truth spilled over like the barley sugar Miss Marple had so deliberately picked up. From shop to post office, the story continued to grow, its threads winding tighter, adding layer after layer, like varnish on old wood. Violet Greville had been secretly engaged to a man whom no respectable family would approve. The engagement had ended in disaster, but the fallout had not been hers alone. There were debts unpaid, money that changed hands in the dark, and whispers of a second family living just beyond the village boundaries, its fortunes rising and falling with each twist in the tale. Welcome to the Curious Case channel, where every story feels like an intimate chat over a cup of coffee. Today, I bring you an electrifying new mystery, featuring one of the sharpest minds in detective fiction. Miss Marple, the beloved amateur sleuth, who has outwitted many, faces a puzzle that will keep you at the edge of your seat. Settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let's journey through this gripping tale together. And if you feel like it, drop a quick comment below to let us know where you're tuning in from. It's always thrilling to see our detective community grow. Now, let's dive into Miss Marple and the Curse of the Sapphire Ring. On a crisp, autumn afternoon, Miss Marple's carriage rattled down the narrow lane leading to Greystone Hall. The sky, a dull, misty grey, hung low over fields drenched by last night's rain. Wrapped in her warm wool coat, Miss Marple gazed out the window, her thoughts wandering between the rhythmic hum of the wheels and the mysterious letter she clutched in her gloved hands. The invitation, sent by Lady Camilla Greville, had arrived unexpectedly, polite yet undeniably urgent, with a strange undercurrent of distress hidden beneath its formal exterior. What piqued her interest the most was the mention of the sapphire ring, a gemstone thought to have vanished decades ago. The ring's sudden reappearance had stirred the village into a frenzy, with rumors swirling of an ancient curse, one that had ruined lives, caused misfortunes, and brought ruin to anyone who dared possess it. As her carriage approached Greystone Hall, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the looming structure. The house, once grand and proud, now stood worn by the passage of time, its stone facade darkened and cracked. Ivy crawled up its walls like a creeping memory, clinging to the eastern wing. The windows, though sparkling clean, reflected shadows rather than light, as if the house itself was hiding something. The carriage came to a sudden stop, and as the door swung open, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine. It was as though someone had been watching for her arrival, anticipating her every move. The butler, an elderly man with a face carved by years of service, greeted her with cold politeness. Yet, in his eyes, Miss Marple noticed something else, a flicker of hesitation, a secret he dared not speak. Stepping into the grand hallway, Miss Marple was not met with warmth, but with an unsettling silence. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. A faint smell of beeswax mixed with something older, more pungent, fear. She had encountered this before in places where too many untold stories lingered. It was the unmistakable atmosphere of a house hiding its darkest truths, a secret that hung in the air, just beyond reach. In the drawing room, Miss Marple was introduced to the guests, each one carefully chosen, their politeness bordering on the artificial. Colonel Brath, with his bristling mustache, and laugh that echoed too loudly for comfort, sat beside his wife, Elana, whose smile was as thin and brittle as glass. Lydia Greville, the young niece of Lady Camilla, appeared outwardly poised, but her eyes betrayed her constant worry, the weight of something unspoken hanging on her every movement. And of course the center of it all, the sapphire ring, encased in a delicate glass box. Its vivid blue hue shimmered eerily under the firelight, almost as though it were alive, aware of its legendary status. Miss Marple noticed the guests' glances shifting toward it, some with open curiosity, others with more furtive, fearful looks. The conversation flowed smoothly, but beneath every word, Miss Marple sensed tension. It was as if each sentence was carefully chosen, as though one wrong word could break the fragile calm. Miss Marple, ever observant, accepted her tea, and let her gaze drift across the room, noting every shift, every glance, every little detail. It was Lady Camilla herself who had invited Miss Marple here, and the old woman's nervous energy was palpable. The invitation was clear. Miss Marple's expertise was needed, but there was more to this case than met the eye. The ring was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a key to something darker, something that had been buried for too long. And Miss Marple, sharp as ever, could already sense the first threads of the mystery beginning to unravel. The dinner at Greystone Hall unfolded under an unsettling atmosphere, as the sapphire ring, now the centerpiece of the evening, silently cast its dark legend upon the room. Lady Camilla Greville, her voice laced with subtle anxiety, began recounting the tragic history of the ring, its origin rooted in a love lost and a life shattered. The cursed heirloom had belonged to Lady Violet Greville, whose fiancé mysteriously disappeared on the night she wore the ring, only to leave behind a trail of disarray and despair. The sapphire then passed to her brother, a man of questionable fortune, who was later found dead in his study, the ring gripped tightly in his lifeless hand. His sudden and unexplained death marked the beginning of the ring's grim legacy. Those who wore it, or even touched it, met with ruin, scandal, or untimely death. The room seemed to hold its breath as the legend unfolded, the guests exchanging furtive glances, each one weighed down by an unspoken fear. Colonel Braithwaite scoffed at the tale, dismissing it as nothing more than fanciful gossip, but his boisterous laugh felt hollow, echoing through the stillness that followed. Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, remained silent, her eyes flickering over the gathered guests. She sensed the undercurrent of dread and suspicion that seemed to cling to the sapphire, far more than any mere superstition. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple's mind whirred, piecing together the fragments of conversation and the subtle hints that were slipping through the cracks in the guests' carefully constructed facades. One thing was certain: Greystone Hall was a house of secrets, and the curse of the sapphire ring had only just begun to reveal the darkness lurking within its walls. The suspense thickened with every passing moment, as Miss Marple quietly awaited the next twist in the tale, her presence unnoticed, but her mind already calculating the truth behind the shadows that haunted the Greville family. The laughter that filled Greystone Hall was forced, masking an undercurrent of unease that no one could completely dismiss. The legendary sapphire ring, a relic from a past soaked in mystery and sorrow, had once again become the focal point of the evening's conversation. Colonel Braithwaite, dismissing it as mere superstition, offered a hearty laugh, but the tension around the table was palpable. Elena Braithwaite's fingers tightened around her glass as her husband's bravado echoed in the room. Lydia Greville tried to smile, but her eyes remained cast downward, avoiding anyone's gaze. Mr. Frobisher, ever the pragmatic solicitor, waved the curse off with an air of indifference, though even he couldn't resist a quick, uneasy glance at the sapphire, as though unwilling to tempt fate by fully turning his back on it. The room fell into an unsettling silence, not born of belief in old legends, but of deeper, more personal fears, fears that were too close to the surface, too raw to remain hidden for long. Miss Marple, seated at the edge of the table, watched everything without a word. She knew that fear often wore the mask of practicality, and beneath the polished facades, there was more than one heart gripped by trepidation. She saw Lady Camilla's hand tremble as she reached for her water glass, the subtle shape betraying the calm she attempted to project. Lydia's eyes darted toward the sapphire, only to snap back down to her plate when she realized she'd been caught. Elena's shoulders were drawn tight, the strain of holding it all together apparent despite the smile she forced. But it was Mr. Frobisher who caught Miss Marple's attention the longest. His quick dismissal had come too hastily, his laugh arriving a beat too late. His hands, though seemingly at rest, were oddly still, unwilling to touch the table, as though proximity to the cursed sapphire might pull him deeper into its dark orbit. The dinner eventually ended, but the tension lingered, settling over them like a dense fog. Conversations took on a lighter tone, but the weight of the ring hung between them all, its legend casting a long shadow. Miss Marple, ever observant, knew that curses, once spoken aloud, were never so easily shrugged off. The past had begun to awaken, and as the guests retreated to their rooms, each step echoed with a growing unease. Some were swift, others hesitant, but no one could escape the creeping sense of inevitability that seemed to follow the sapphire's dark influence. In the stillness of the house, Miss Marple couldn't help but wonder, what if the real ghosts didn't haunt the corridors, but instead lived quietly in the hearts of the living, waiting to be unleashed. The morning came, but with it, a scream, sharp, brittle, and full of terror. Lydia Greville's voice echoed down the hall, shattering the uneasy silence of the house. The guests rushed to Mr. Frobisher's room, finding the door bolted from the inside. When they broke it open, the sight that met them was chilling. Frobisher, lifeless, his face pale and fixed in an expression of surprise, and on his finger, gleaming in the morning light, was the sapphire ring. The room froze, all eyes on the cursed object, its dark reputation now a living presence in the room. But Miss Marple's gaze didn't stay on the ring. Her sharp eyes caught something else. The way Frobisher's hand lay upon the coverlet, fingers curled just so, as though he had been in the act of placing something, perhaps the ring itself, before death had claimed him. Panic erupted in the house as the curse was invoked once more, with Mrs. Braithwaite trembling as she whispered, "It's the sapphire. I told you nothing good would come of its return." Her husband dismissed her, but his voice faltered, his usual bravado missing. Lady Camilla, trying to calm the situation, was drowned out by the rising tide of hysteria. Old stories resurfaced from the depths of memory, each one feeding the fear that now gripped Greystone Hall. The curse, it seemed, was real, its power far from spent, and Miss Marple, ever the silent observer, knew this was only the beginning of a far darker tale. As the atmosphere thickened with uncertainty, the guests of Greystone Hall seemed to shrink under the weight of their own anxieties. The night had begun with nervous banter, the legend of the sapphire ring whispered like a ghost in the corners of every conversation. But now it had taken on a life of its own, growing darker with every passing moment. Miss Marple, ever the observer, noted the subtle tremors in Lydia's hands, her attempt to smile, as though it might ease the tension that wrapped around her like a shroud. Eleanor, Mrs. Braithwaite, and the others tried to dismiss the curse with forced nonchalance, yet their eyes betrayed them, glancing nervously at the ring, the ancient stone that seemed to breathe with malice. No one spoke aloud of what they feared, yet every action, every glance, every too perfectly timed denial revealed more than words could. In the silent ballet of their reactions, Miss Marple saw the truth. Guilt was not always about crime. It often whispered in the small gestures, in the tightness of a smile, in the silence that filled the space between accusations. As dinner ended, and the guests retreated to their rooms, Miss Marple remained quiet, her mind whirling with possibilities. She had seen fear twist people's lives before, seen it grow into a monster fed by secrets too dark to name. But this, she knew, was something more. The curse, once invoked, had a life of its own, and its shadows were no longer confined to legends. The following morning, the scream that shattered the stillness, was a testament to that. The body of Mr. Frobisher, cold and pale in his bed, lay with a finger pointing toward the sapphire ring, as if it had claimed its prize. The room locked from the inside, the door bolted with a finality that sent a chill down everyone's spine. Panic spread like wildfire as the others gathered, speculating wildly, each blaming the curse, or an old grievance long buried. Yet Miss Marple's gaze fell not on the ring, but on the hand of the victim, whose fingers were not still in death's grasp, but curled, as though trying to hold on to something. And beneath that hand, nearly missed in the chaos, was a scrap of paper, hastily torn, its creases a silent testament to something important that had been forgotten in the rush of fear. As her mind pieced together the fractured details, Miss Marple understood, this was no accident. Someone had manipulated fear itself to create the perfect illusion. The real mystery wasn't the sapphire ring, or the locked door, it was the truth hiding in plain sight, buried in the tension between each terrified breath. As the morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Greystone Hall, the tension in the air was palpable. Breakfast, a ritual meant to bring a semblance of normalcy, had become a farce, each guest performing their part in a thinly veiled charade of civility. Lydia Greville, the youngest of the group, could not tear her eyes away from her plate, her fork moving absent-mindedly, as though each bite could push away the gnawing terror that clung to her every thought. Her fingers trembled slightly, betraying her attempts at composure. Lady Camilla, who had always been graceful, poured tea with an unsettling tremor in her hands, a subtle yet undeniable sign of the storm brewing within her. Colonel Braithwaite, ever the embodiment of authority, seemed to overcompensate for the growing unease, his voice booming a little too loudly, his stories rambling and disconnected as though trying to fill the silence that threatened to consume them. Beside him, Mrs. Braithwaite, usually sharp-tongued and ready to command attention, now sat in unnatural, her eyes constantly darting toward the empty chair where Mr. Frobisher had sat the night before. The absence was a reminder too stark, too haunting for her to ignore. Miss Marple, however, remained an island of calm in the chaos. She knew better than to join in the frantic reassurances and false smiles. Her silence was not empty, it was filled with understanding. She had learned long ago that when fear takes hold, people talk not to inform but to pacify themselves. It was in these moments of desperation to seem composed that they inadvertently revealed more than they realized. A missed glance here, a too quick denial there, a flicker of something hidden beneath the surface. Colonel Braithwaite was the first to offer his version of the previous night's events, perhaps too eager to establish his own innocence before anyone could question him. His voice was too loud, his actions too deliberate. "We all retired at a reasonable hour," he said, his knife digging into his toast with unnecessary force. "I certainly heard nothing during the night, slept like a log." His words rang hollow, and his wife's silence spoke volumes. Mrs. Braithwaite did not meet anyone's gaze. Her eyes remained fixed on the empty chair, betraying the truth she was unwilling to voice. It was not just the absence of Mr. Frobisher that haunted her, but the weight of something darker, something unsaid. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught every detail. The trembling hands, the forced joviality, the way each person clung to their own version of events. But it was the small things, the tiny fractures in their stories, that intrigued her most. The way Colonel Braithwaite's explanation seemed too rehearsed, as though he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. How Lydia's silence spoke volumes. Her avoidance of eye contact, a clear sign of guilt or fear. Miss Marple had seen this dance before. Fear had a way of making people defensive, of twisting their perceptions, and forcing them to retreat behind half-truths. And in the silence between words, in the hesitation before the next carefully crafted sentence, she could almost hear the truth whispering, waiting to be uncovered. Lydia's voice trembled as she murmured, confirming only that sleep had eluded her, prompting her to wander the halls. She was quick to add, however, that she had never gone near Mr. Frobisher's room, her words edged with uncertainty. Miss Marple listened intently, her expression calm and unhurried. With a gentle prodding, she asked Lydia the sort of questions that, though seemingly harmless, could unravel even the tightest of alibis. What time did you walk? Was it before or after Lady Camilla's light went out? Did you hear any doors open or close? The questions were simple, yet they caused the details to shift and blur. Lady Camilla swore her light had been extinguished precisely at 11, yet Mrs. Braithwaite insisted she had seen light under the door long past midnight. A faint but deliberate pause from Lydia followed, a subtle giveaway that her own memories were not as certain as she'd hoped. Miss Marple asked no accusations, only listened with quiet precision, allowing the tangled threads of truth to fray without interference. The moment that followed was small, but to Miss Marple, it was significant. As Lydia reached for the butter dish, her eyes flicked toward Lady Camilla for a brief instant, too brief to be intentional, too charged to be ignored. Lady Camilla's gaze met hers, and for the briefest of moments, time seemed to freeze. In that frozen instant, Miss Marple understood there was history between these two women, shared and unspoken, a bond forged not in friendship but in secrets far too dangerous to voice. The connection, however fleeting, was laden with guilt, or perhaps something even darker, knowledge of a sin committed or a betrayal, hidden from prying eyes. No one else noticed. Colonel Braithwaite was lost in his own blustery tirade, and Mrs. Braithwaite had retreated into a quiet place of her own, a silent observer of events. But Miss Marple had spent years watching villagers, learning that it was never the words they spoke that betrayed them. It was always the silence, the pauses, the subtle shifts in behavior that spoke volumes. What passed between Lady Camilla and Lydia was not new. Miss Marple had seen such exchanges before, but this moment carried with it a new weight, the kind of weight that only emerges when old secrets collide with fresh guilt. Later that morning, Miss Marple took a leisurely walk down the corridor, careful to keep her steps unhurried and casual. It wasn't her intention to eavesdrop, but the murmur of voices drifting from a slightly open door caught her attention. The voices were low but sharp, their tension as palpable as the crackle of an electrical storm. Without thinking, her ear drew closer, guided by the irresistible pull of something hidden in the air, something that begged to be uncovered. As the words flowed from behind the door, Miss Marple knew this was where the answers lay. A low, urgent whisper slithered through the crack in the door, its words barely audible yet laden with an undeniable sense of dread. "He seeks the pole," a woman's voice murmured, tight with unspoken urgency. The reply came, rough and low, "Mr. Henshaw," followed by a pause that seemed to stretch for eternity. Then the answer, chilling in its simplicity. Because he knew too much, because of what happened before. If it all came out, a sudden sharp silence followed, the door creaking shut with a muffled thud. By the time Miss Marple passed the room, it was empty, save for the lingering tension in the air. She continued her walk, her face a mask of calm, but inside her mind was already stitching together the fragmented truths she had just overheard. Mr. Frobisher had not been murdered for what he might reveal. He had been silenced because of what he already knew. His death wasn't rooted in the present, but in the dark, twisted shadows of the past, a past that had been buried beneath layers of secrets, just waiting to claw its way to the surface. By afternoon, Miss Marple sat alone in the dimly lit library, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Her thoughts had drifted far beyond the Sapphire, or the so-called curse that had once seemed so pivotal to the mystery. Now those things were little more than background noise, distractions from the real truth. The threads in her mind wove a much darker and more personal pattern, one formed from the tangle of old fears, hidden connections, and guilt that had been quietly festering for decades. She was no closer to understanding how Mr. Frobisher had been killed behind a locked door, or who was responsible. But one thing was clear, the past was not as dead as people believed. It was very much alive, breathing beneath the very roof of Greystone Hall, waiting for the perfect moment to stretch out its hand, perhaps with a gentle touch, but more likely with the cold, lethal push of a long-held secret finally spilling into the light. Miss Marple had no doubt that before the weekend ended, The past would rise again, and it would claim what it was owed. The house for once seemed distracted. Lady Camilla flitted between quiet consolations for Lydia. Colonel Braithwaite was embroiled in a heated argument with the constable over the ridiculousness of curses, and Mrs. Braithwaite, pale and withdrawn, had retreated to her room, seemingly lost in her own troubled thoughts. Miss Marple, ever unnoticed, seized the opportunity to slip quietly upstairs. She had long suspected that houses, particularly ones like Greystone Hall, were more than just structures. They were silent witnesses to the truth, holding memories within their walls that no one could erase. She had always believed that the attic, that forgotten space where time and dust gathered in thick layers, often held the answers no locked diary or whispered conversation could reveal. And today, Miss Marple was certain that the attic would finally yield its secrets. With deliberate, measured steps, Miss Marple ascended the narrow staircase, her fingers lightly grazing the cold, smooth surface of the wall. The wood felt unnaturally cold beneath her touch, as though it were alive, bearing the weight of years, no, perhaps centuries of secrets. There was something else too, a faint sensation that clung to the air around her, a sense of waiting, almost as if the house itself were holding its breath in anticipation of what she might uncover. The attic, as she had expected, had the particular stillness of a room long forgotten by the world below. It was untouched by warmth, its air thick with the weight of time. Miss Marple moved cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the dim flickering light, her senses honed to perceive what others would have dismissed as inconsequential. Around her, trunks were stacked haphazardly, some open with their contents spilling out, others tightly sealed with rusted clasps. Each one seemed to whisper secrets long buried, forgotten relics of a past no one had cared to revisit. Amidst the clutter, her hand paused over a small, unremarkable wooden box. It was coated in a thin layer of dust, yet something about it told her that it had been disturbed recently, as though someone had hurriedly searched it and then abandoned it just as quickly. When she lifted the lid, she was met with a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded silk ribbon, their contents clearly cherished yet carefully concealed. The letters had lain undisturbed for decades, but now, they hummed with an unsettling energy, as though the words inside were desperate to be heard. Miss Marple's fingers trembled as she unwrapped the first page. The ink faded, yet the words leaped off the page with startling clarity, as though the past itself had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment to be revealed. The letters told a story of a secret engagement, one so scandalous that it had been buried by the family long before any of the present generation had come into existence. Lady Violet Greville had once been promised to a young artist, a man of no wealth, no station, yet with a heart full of passion and devotion. The sapphire ring she wore had been a symbol of that love, passed down from her mother, a token of a future filled with hope and happiness. But within weeks, everything had unraveled. The engagement had been destroyed by a whispered betrayal, a sudden disappearance, and the sapphire ring, once a symbol of love, was now a mark of disgrace. The scandal that followed had been carefully controlled, half-truths whispered in dark corners, deliberate silences put in place to ensure that the family's reputation remained intact. Violet's fiancé had vanished under circumstances so delicate that no one dared speak of them. Violet herself was sent abroad, her disgrace rewritten as an illness, a time spent recovering in a secluded rest home. The sapphire, the emblem of her lost love, had been returned to the family safe, where it remained hidden, a silent reminder of a past too painful to acknowledge. The letters, long sealed and forgotten, now spoke of secrets that had been buried, but not erased, waiting for the right moment to resurface, to unravel everything. And Miss Marple knew, deep within her bones, that this was only the beginning. The curse, Miss Marple realized, had never truly belonged to the sapphire. It was a construct, a tale spun by necessity, born of desperation to hide a family's darkest secret. What had started as a story to conceal the scandal had morphed into something far more insidious, a legend, repeated so often that it had taken on a life of its own, ensnaring everyone, even the family, in its myth. It had become their truth. Miss Marple folded the letters carefully, returning them to their hiding place, her expression serene, though her mind had sharpened to a single undeniable point. The real curse was not of supernatural origin. It was the curse of guilt, of silence and of secrets that had gone unspoken for far too long. It was a curse tied to the family itself, a weight they had carried for generations, like an invisible hand pressing down on them, choking them with the unspoken truths they refused to confront. What unsettled Miss Marple most was not the betrayal she had uncovered. Such things were sadly common, but the cold, deliberate transformation of a real tragedy into folklore. A story meant to mislead and obscure the truth, both from outsiders and from the family's own descendants. A curse was simply a truth no one dared utter aloud, and as she sat in the stillness of the attic, Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty that someone downstairs, someone present at that very moment, was not only aware of the truth, but had every intention of keeping it buried. The past, she thought, was a patient thing. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for someone to stir it from its slumber. Descending the stairs, Miss Marple felt the weight of what she had discovered settle within her. The weekend's tragedy hadn't begun with Mr. Frobisher's death, nor had it begun with the Sapphire's return to the family's vault. No, it had started much earlier, in the shadowy corners of Greystone Hall, where whispered secrets and family shame festered, hidden beneath layers of silence. The truth had been too costly to speak, and so it had been buried, festering in the dark. But now, it had reared its head once more, reaching out through the sapphire ring, through the murder of a man who had learned too much. As Miss Marple returned to the house, her mind set on the truth, she knew the past was no longer content to remain hidden. It was clawing its way to the surface, and it would not stop until its debt had been paid. Downstairs, the quiet buzz of conversation was suddenly shattered by hurried footsteps and raised voices. The sapphire, the very symbol of the family's tainted past, had gone missing. The glass case on the mantel, which had always housed the cursed ring, was now empty. The lock had been forced open, the velvet beneath it disturbed as though someone had recently handled it. Panic rippled through the house. The missing sapphire was more than just a valuable heirloom, it was the key to everything. Whoever had taken it had not simply stolen a piece of jewelry, they had taken the past along with it. Miss Marple stood in the hallway, the weight of what was unfolding pressing upon her. The house had awakened, and with it, the truth that had been buried for so long. Now the family's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and Miss Marple was certain that the consequences would be far worse than anyone had imagined. Where the sapphire had once rested, Lady Camilla stood ashen, her fingers trembling at her collar, as though she could somehow will the missing jewel back into existence. Beside her, Lydia remained silent and pale, her hands gripped together so tightly that her knuckles were a stark, ghostly white against her skin. The room was charged with tension. Colonel Braithwaite, his usual bluster masking a deep unease, demanded answers, his voice booming through the room as though the sheer force of it could command the truth to reveal itself. Mrs. Braw sat still, her back ramrod straight, an unreadable expression on her face as though she had been waiting for this moment all along, prepared for the inevitable unraveling of their carefully constructed facades. Miss Marple arrived quietly, her presence calm and composed, taking in the scene with a practiced eye. This was not the first time she had witnessed fear masked by indignation, nor would it be the last. The atmosphere was thick with accusation and fear. The missing sapphire, now the centerpiece of this gathering, overshadowing the murder that had already cast a long shadow over the household. It was no simple theft, Miss Marple knew. In a house where death had already taken its toll, the disappearance of the sapphire carried with it far greater significance than mere opportunism. Whether it was taken to protect a secret, or to conceal a deeper truth, its vanishing was no accident. As expected, the household split almost immediately into two camps. One faction, steeped in superstition, whispered darkly about curses and ancient wrongs, about objects that carried with them the weight of death, their mere touch enough to bring ruin. On the other side, the more practical-minded insisted it was simply a case of theft, someone seizing an opportunity in the chaos, perhaps even the same person who had ended Mr. Frobisher's life. Yet, it was not the arguments themselves that captured Miss Marple's attention, but the faces behind them. Those who clung most desperately to superstition were often the ones hiding the deepest fears, their belief in the curse a veil for their own guilt. The proponents of cold logic, on the other hand, clung to the illusion of control, their insistence on reason often betraying their fear of the unknown. Every whispered word, every detail that emerged brought Miss Marple one step closer to the truth. It was no longer just about the stolen sapphire, but about the secrets buried beneath the village's calm facade. The deeper she dug, the more she realized that this story was not just about an heirloom. This was about a legacy, hidden in the shadows, and it was one that had the power to tear everything apart. Miss Marple, as always, wove the fragmented stories together with the grace of a seasoned weaver, connecting the names casually tossed about at breakfast to those long forgotten in the village's collective memory. At the center of it all, the sapphire ring was not just a cursed object, but a symbol of something far darker, a currency of guilt. It had passed from hand to hand over the years, silently binding those who had touched it in a shared, unspoken understanding. This was no mere family heirloom, no jewel of any intrinsic value. It represented who had triumphed, who had been crushed beneath the weight of loss, and who had quietly endured the suffering in silence while maintaining the decorum of the drawing room. It was a postmistress, careless in her confidence, who revealed the final, most crucial piece of the puzzle. She didn't mean to. She spoke without thinking, assuming that everyone in the room already shared the same story. "Of course," she said, stirring her tea. "He's been back before, hasn't he? Not that anyone would call him by his real name now. Makes you wonder if Lady Camilla knew all along." Miss Marple's smile remained unchanged, but her mind, always sharp, began to sharpen even further. One of the guests had lied, not about where they were the night before, but about who they truly were. A new name, a respectable history built carefully over the years, but beneath the layers of falsehood, the truth was entwined in the very fabric of Greystone Hall's darkest secrets. This guest was not some innocent visitor, nor were they a forgotten relative who happened to drop by. They were part of the old feud, a bitter past that connected them to Violet's tragic engagement, and more importantly, to the events that had stained the sapphire with something far more dangerous than mere superstition. This guest had returned to Greystone Hall with unfinished business, and the more Miss Marple considered it, the more certain she became that they had a motive strong enough to kill. As she returned to the house, her thoughts were clear, each strand of gossip carefully sorted like the knitting in her bag. The murder of Mr. Frobisher, the theft of the sapphire, the tense atmosphere that had clung to the house from the moment she arrived. They were not separate incidents, but parts of the same tapestry, woven from the threads of greed, betrayal, and the lingering bitterness of a scandal that had never truly been resolved. Miss Marple now understood. The killer's motive wasn't fear of the curse, nor was it greed for the sapphire itself. It was the need to silence a secret, one that had festered for years, hidden beneath layers of deception and deceit. The past was not just a shadow, it was a ticking time bomb, and someone had been willing to kill to prevent it from ever seeing the light of day. It was fear, unmistakable and palpable, that gripped the hearts of the inhabitants of Greystone Hall as the weight of unspoken truths began to settle in. Miss Marple, stepping quietly into the shadows of the grand hallway, knew this much for certain. The past, long silenced, was no longer content to whisper from the corners of the village shop. It had arrived at Greystone Hall with a vengeance, its secrets demanding to be unearthed. By mid-afternoon, the household, already on edge, had settled on a scapegoat, someone who seemed an outsider, never quite fitting into the delicate social structure of the hall. Henshaw, the solicitor, became the prime suspect, his connection to the sapphire's reappearance so thin it could have been dismissed as coincidence. But when fear clouds judgment, even the most tenuous link becomes a towering thread of evidence. Whispers about his past began to circulate, his financial troubles, his estranged family, and a particularly messy dispute over a contested will. None of these accusations were relevant to the case at hand, but they were enough to paint him as a man who might be desperate enough to steal a valuable ring, or silence someone who knew too much. Miss Marple, ever the observer, allowed the drama to unfold around her, her knitting needles clicking methodically in rhythm with the mounting tension. She thought about how often the guilty, in their haste to rid themselves of suspicion, end up portraying their own innocence in a way that only further confirms their guilt. The house had already made its decision, but Miss Marple wasn't so easily swayed. True guilt, she knew, doesn't announce itself so loudly. It hides, it waits, it acts with caution. And if there was one thing Mr. Henshaw lacked, it was caution. The solicitor, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, grew increasingly defensive. Every word he spoke, every attempt at deflection, seemed overly rehearsed, too forcefully innocent. At lunch, when the subject of the missing sapphire casually drifted back into conversation, he took it upon himself to speak at great length about his own sterling character, his honorable career, his unwavering respect for the Greville family, and his impeccable honesty. It was as though he were answering questions no one had thought to ask. Each explanation, each protestation of innocence, only served to deepen the suspicion that had already begun to consume the household. Mrs. Braithwaite exchanged a knowing look with the others, her face a mask of quiet certainty. The house had made its decision, but Miss Marple knew the truth was far from what it appeared. The threads were tightening, and the deeper they pulled, the darker the tapestry became. The room fell into an uneasy silence, as Lady Camilla exchanged knowing glances with Lydia, her gaze demurely lowered, too polite to speak. It was the subtle tension that Miss Marple found particularly telling. Everyone had their suspicions, but the ease with which Mr. Henshaw had been cast as the villain seemed almost too convenient. Yes, he was a man of flaws, his defensive posture, his nervous explanations, but Miss Marple saw beyond the surface. His guilt, if indeed there was any, was not the kind that screamed murder. No, his guilt was more human, an unspoken panic, a man who had entered a room already brimming with suspicion, and realized far too late that his presence had made him the perfect target. But it wasn't his guilt that Miss Marple found most curious. It was how easily the others had fallen into their roles, casting him as the perpetrator without a second thought. For someone like Mr. Henshaw, whose flaws were laid bare for all to see, to protest his innocence, seemed almost too rehearsed, too desperate. People like him didn't need to declare their honesty. They simply tried to fade into the background, hoping to be forgotten. By the time tea arrived, the conversation had shifted to trivialities, as it always did in the quiet, safe moments of the day. The house was steeped in a false calm, and the household allowed their guard to drop, if only briefly. It was Colonel Braithwaite, always the one to voice an opinion, who first brought up the attic, complaining about the drafts and the old beams that creaked with every gust of wind. Mrs. Braithwaite, sharp as ever, corrected him on some minor detail about the renovations. And then, to Miss Marple's surprise, Mr. Henshaw spoke up, his voice casual as he buttered his scone. "Terrible place, that attic," he remarked, almost too easily, "though I suppose after what happened there all those years ago, it's hardly surprising." The air grew thick, and for a moment the room seemed to freeze. The mention of what happened there all those years ago was a sharp, uninvited reminder of the darkest chapter in the Greville family's history. An episode long buried, a scandal that no outsider should have known about, least of all a guest like Mr. Henshaw, who had only ever dealt with wills and land deeds, and had no claim to the family's secrets. Miss Marple's cup, hovering just short of her lips, faltered in her hand. The slip, though small, was significant. In that brief moment, the carefully constructed veneer of civility cracked, and what had been a lie suddenly grew too bold, too confident. It was a telling mistake, one that betrayed the person behind it. And so, just like that, the entire puzzle began to shift in Miss Marple's mind. The sapphire, the theft, the murder, each piece had been deliberately draped in the convenient shadow of a curse. And though Mr. Henshaw's bumbling defensiveness had made him an easy target, he had never been the mastermind behind the plot. No, he was a red herring, his troubled past and his obvious discomfort making him the perfect scapegoat. The real story was much darker, much more intricate than anyone had imagined. As Miss Marple quietly set her cup down, she knew that the pieces were falling into place, and the web of deception was far more tangled than anyone had yet realized. The atmosphere in the drawing room shifted, as Miss Marple's sharp gaze swept over the gathered faces, each one a study in discomfort. The weight of suspicion hung thick in the air, yet there was an unspoken understanding that the true culprit was someone far more intimately tied to the history of Greystone Hall. Someone whose ties to the estate ran deeper than the others dared to admit. It had been a calculated move, turning the household's gaze towards Mr. Henshaw, a man with a past full of flaws that made him the perfect scapegoat. For a time, it had worked, but guilt, Miss Marple knew, was not so easily disguised. It left its fingerprints in the most subtle of ways, not on objects, but in conversation, in the nervous hesitation, the unwarranted denials, the small but telling details that slipped out of the mouths of those who should have known better. It was in these moments, when the mask slipped, that Miss Marple found her clues. As the teacups were cleared away, and the chatter of trivialities resumed, Miss Marple's mind had already moved past Mr. Henshaw. His role in this puzzle had been nothing more than a distraction, a misdirection to keep the others off track. The true villain had been hiding in plain sight, and their carefully guarded secret, once buried beneath layers of family shame, was now exposed, raw and aching, like an old wound reopened. The summons to the drawing room came quietly, but with a firm authority that left no room for doubt. No one questioned Miss Marple's command. One by one, the household members assembled, some curious, others anxious, but all too aware that the reckoning was upon them. Miss Marple stood before the fireplace, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Her expression, as always, was composed, almost mild, yet there was an undeniable tension in the air. It was the silence that spoke volumes, the palpable sense that the unspoken truth was about to be laid bare. Colonel Braithwaite cleared his throat nervously. Lady Camilla perched on the edge of her chair, her fingers twitching in her lap, and Lydia, ever so polite, kept her hands tightly clasped, betraying her growing unease. Henshaw, too, lingered by the door, uncertain whether to make another defense or simply flee. Miss Marple smiled faintly, but when she spoke, her voice was soft yet piercing, like a surgeon's scalpel cutting through the tension. "The trouble with curses," she began, her gaze sweeping the room, "is that they often find their appeal among those with something to hide." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She turned slightly, her eyes landing briefly on Lady Camilla. "A ghost story is far easier to live with than the truth," Miss Marple continued, her tone unwavering. "The sapphire ring," she said, "was never cursed in any supernatural sense. It has, however, been cursed time and time again, by human greed, jealousy, and the need to obscure uncomfortable truths." Her eyes locked with Lady Camilla's, for a brief, intense moment before she glanced around the room, her gaze settling on each individual in turn. "The true curse," Miss Marple went on, "was not in the ring itself, but in the family's desperate attempts to rewrite their past into something more palatable, more romantic, something that could be told in polite circles without the fear of scandal." The room seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple's words hung in the air, her calm demeanor belying the storm she was about to unleash. The truth, once hidden behind layers of lies and distractions, was about to be revealed, and it would change everything for those involved. The sapphire had become more than just a valuable piece of jewelry. It had morphed into a convenient scapegoat, a way to place blame on something tangible rather than confronting the darker truths lurking within the walls of Greystone Hall. The object, once mere property, now bore the weight of accusations and superstitions, absorbing the guilt and suspicion of those who wished to deflect responsibility. As Miss Marple spoke, she revealed a crucial truth. The moment the sapphire was brought back into the house, it ceased being an artifact of the past and became a mirror. Not a reflection of ancient spirits or curses, but a mirror to the very real, very human fears and insecurities of the people in this room. The theft, the death, and the rising suspicion were not caused by an otherworldly force, but by the nature of human beings themselves, reaching for the most convenient explanation, the one that absolved them of their own complicity. Step by step, Miss Marple began dismantling the carefully crafted fabrications that had been woven around the events. What had seemed like polite conversation and innocent behavior now unraveled under the weight of truth. Lady Camilla, who had seemed so poised and controlled, had been hiding a much darker secret. Her so-called early retirement was a lie. In reality, she had returned to the drawing room alone after the others had gone to bed, and the reason was clear: to check on the Sapphire. She had feared that any disturbance, any question, could bring old family scandals to light, and she couldn't risk it. Lydia, too, was hiding her own secret. Her midnight walk had not been the result of a nervous fit, as she had claimed. Instead, she had been summoned by a mysterious note, slipped under her door, warning her to keep quiet, to ensure her silence. Then there was Mrs. Braithwaite, whose absence had seemed odd and unexplained. Miss Marple revealed the truth. She had not been searching for answers, but rather working to ensure nothing would be discovered. No forgotten letters, no traces of a long-buried scandal that could unravel everything. As each alibi crumbled, it became clear that the truth was not supernatural in nature. It wasn't a curse or a ghost haunting them, but a web of human actions, each driven by a desire to protect something, whether it was reputation, greed, or guilt. The final key to unlocking the mystery, however, lay in the theft of the sapphire itself. Miss Marple's revelation was chilling in its simplicity. The theft had never been intended to succeed. It was a calculated performance, a theatrical ruse designed to deepen the belief in the curse and shift the focus away from the true culprit. Frobisher had been manipulated to ensure that everyone would look to the supernatural, ghosts and legends, rather than to the person who had the most to lose if the secrets of Greystone Hall were ever exposed. The locked room, the missing sapphire, the hidden past, they were all part of a carefully constructed narrative to misdirect and deceive. The real motive, as Miss Marple's calm voice carried across the room, was driven by something far darker than mere superstition. Clutched tightly in the dead man's hand, the sapphire was arranged with precision, an object so perfectly positioned it made the death appear unexplainable, a case wrapped in mystery and impossibility. Yet, as Miss Marple calmly observed, the true clue was far simpler than anyone could have imagined. The victim had known the truth. He had been prepared to share it, to reveal the lies that had bound Greystone Hall for so long. He had no reason to fear the curse, only the very real, very human threat posed by someone desperate enough to stop him. The murder, it seemed, had not been committed for wealth, or even for the sapphire itself. No, it was done to protect a lie that had been meticulously woven into the fabric of the family history, a lie so ingrained that it had kept the house together for decades. And in trying to protect that lie, the murderer had unwittingly invoked the very curse they sought to exploit, dooming themselves in the process. Miss Marple's voice grew softer, but every word was sharp with clarity. The murderer's actions had not been motivated by hatred, she explained, but by sheer desperation. The moment had arrived for the truth to be exposed, and the person who had staged the scene, the one who had stolen the sapphire and silenced Mr. Frobisher, had done so not out of malice, but out of a fear so consuming, it overshadowed everything else. Her eyes turned toward Mrs. Braithwaite, and in that brief moment, it was clear Mrs. Braithwaite had known. She had known that if the truth ever came to light, her life, her position in Greystone Hall, and the carefully constructed facade of her world would crumble. It was Mrs. Braithwaite, many years ago, who had been the catalyst for the chain of events that had led to this moment. She had taken a letter that should never have seen the light of day, and in doing so, she had set in motion a series of actions that ensured the sapphire's curse would live on, not in the stone itself, but in the lies that surrounded it. As Miss Marple's words sank in, Mrs. Braithwaite's hands trembled, her composure faltering just enough to betray the truth she had tried so hard to bury. There was no protest from her as they escorted her from the room. Her body remained rigid, her posture upright, as though clinging to the last shred of dignity in a desperate attempt to control the unraveling truth. But it was too late. The weight of her silence had been broken. The other guests too stood in silence, not out of sympathy, but a shared unease, as if the truth had cast an uncomfortable shadow over them all. They were not merely witness to a revelation, they were complicit in the very lies that had led to it. The curse, Miss Marple had explained, was never in the sapphire. It had always been in the fear, in the lies, in the lengths people would go to in order to protect their own secrets. And now, with the truth laid bare before them, no one could escape the consequences. The lies had been exposed, and in the end it was not the sapphire that had cursed them, but the fear of truth that had driven them all to destruction. A heavy reflective silence blanketed the room, each guest lost in their own labyrinth of guilt and revelation, weighing their private sins against the truth that had just been so mercilessly unearthed. Colonel Braithwaite, once the embodiment of authority and pride, now sat hollow-eyed, his gaze locked onto the floor, a man quietly crumbling under the realization that he had lived alongside a stranger all these years. Lady Camilla's usually steady hands quivered as they lay clenched in her lap, her face pale with the knowledge of how fragile the facade of her life had been. Young Lydia's eyes clung to the doorway, unmoving and glassy, as if expecting some new terror to cross the threshold, trapped in a fear only she understood. Even Mr. Henshaw, who had been exonerated, appeared somehow smaller, bowed under the crushing weight of what might have been, of a life so nearly destroyed by suspicion. Miss Marple stood apart, silent now, her part complete. The facts were laid bare, but she knew too well that truth, once revealed, did not offer neat endings. Justice was never clean. It left scars, unseen but deeply felt, in every life it touched. One life was lost forever, another was shattered beyond repair, and no unveiling of secrets could ever mend the tangled web of hurt and betrayal that had led them here. Later that evening, tucked away in the small dimly lit sitting room, Miss Marple sat alone, nursing a cup of tea, whose simple warmth offered some fragile comfort against the cold bite of broken illusions. Across from her the sapphire, now safely locked back in its velvet case, glittered under the low glow of a brass lamp. She gazed at it, not with fear, but with a profound, almost sorrowful understanding. The curse had never belonged to the stone. A jewel is a silent witness, lifeless, incapable of evil or fate. It was not the sapphire that had poisoned Greystone Hall. It was the festering wounds of human hearts, the unspoken jealousies, the desperate lies, the silent betrayals, passed down through whispered conversations and guarded glances like heirlooms too heavy to carry. Those were the real curses: greed that rotted the soul, guilt that gnawed at reason, resentment that hardened into cruelty. The sapphire had merely reflected what already lived within them, a mirror catching the glint of every secret longing and unconfessed sin. Greystone Hall had never been haunted by spirits. It had been haunted by human weakness, that most ancient and insidious ghost, slipping through walls and curling into the spaces between words until one heart, too burdened to carry the silence, had finally broken. The house itself seemed changed now, breathing differently, as if it had exhaled a long-held breath of pain, but found no relief in its release. The guests moved through its grand but hollow halls with a new cautiousness, their steps softer, their voices stripped of pretense, reduced to low murmurs of reflection and unease. It was as though the very walls, having borne witness to too many hidden shames, now demanded reverence. Greystone Hall stood still, scarred by the truth it could no longer contain, and in that aching silence, Miss Marple saw it clearly. Not every ghost wears chains and shrouds. Some walk among the living, their presence felt in every half-spoken word, every glance weighted by what remains unsaid. Colonel Ashcroft retreated wordlessly into his dimly lit study, the door closing with a soft but final click, leaving Lady Evelina alone in the parlor, where she sat motionless, her once proud posture collapsed into something frail and uncertain. Her eyes, unfocused and glassy, stared past the ornate furnishings, as if chasing the ghost of some private regret she could neither name nor escape. Near the tall arched window, young Beatrice stood, the dying afternoon light bathing her in a pale gold glow that made her look both startlingly young and strangely aged, like someone newly released from invisible chains she had worn too long to recognize. Even the servants, usually brisk and invisible, moved with an odd, muted reverence, performing their tasks with the delicate caution of mourners, tidying after a wake, careful not to disturb the lingering spirits of things best left undisturbed. In the corner of the room, Miss Arlen sat quietly knitting, her hands deft, her face composed, but her sharp eyes betraying a deeper understanding that calm is a mask, and silence does not always mean peace. Some truths, she knew, settle like dust, quietly covering everything with time. But others, more venomous, cling like smoke, impossible to clean, seeping into the very fabric of the people and places they touch. There are houses, and families, that never truly recover from what they've witnessed. The walls remember even if the living pretend to forget. Later, just before retreating for the night, Miss Arlen lingered by the doorway of the drawing room, her gaze inevitably drawn back to the object at the center of so much unrest. The emerald, now encased behind fresh gleaming glass, lay still and mute, a mere stone to any casual eye, yet carrying a weight that defied explanation. A soft draught stirred the heavy air, barely enough to notice, except that it caused the single candle on the mantel to quiver, its flame bowing low before righting itself again, throwing a thin, restless shadow along the cracked wall. Miss Arlen's lips curved into a small, secretive smile, the smile of someone who had long ago made peace with the idea that not every story needs a neat ending, that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only lived with. For while human nature, with all its frailties, greed, jealousy, guilt, can explain most tragedies, there remain moments, rare and unsettling, where the world seems to whisper that reason does not govern all corners of existence. Greystone Manor would heal, in its way as all living things do. Laughter would one day echo in its halls again, fresh lies would find homes in its creaking floorboards, and new secrets would seep into its walls. But deep beneath the surface, the house would remember, not the supposed curse of the emerald, not the old legends woven in hushed gossip, but the undeniable, raw truth it had revealed about the human heart. Perhaps, somewhere beyond the reach of logic, a true curse still lingered, not embedded in a stone or a place, but in the very capacity of people to damage and betray, to turn love into possession, and loyalty into weapon. As Miss Arlen took a slow sip of her cooling tea, and the old house settled into a fitful, uneasy sleep, one certainty settled deep within her. The real danger had never glinted from a jewel or whispered through a legend. It had lived all along in the hearts that clutched so desperately at the illusion of control, hearts that would inevitably betray themselves. The real curse, it seemed, had never belonged to an ancient artifact or whispered ghost stories. It had always lived deep within the hearts of those who carried burdens too heavy, secrets too dark to face in the light of day. Hawthorne Manor, for all its towering beauty and crumbling elegance, needed no specters to haunt its long, lonely corridors. Guilt was more than sufficient. It oozed from the cracks in the walls, lurked in the corners, where the light never reached, and echoed faintly with every hesitant footstep. The desperate, almost frantic urge to bury the truth, to rewrite uncomfortable histories, to shield fragile reputations at any cost, was the true poison that soaked into the very bones of the house. And in the end, it was not the work of a vengeful spirit that claimed a life, but the much more familiar and tragic frailty of ordinary human weakness, which leaves us now with a lingering question, one not so easily dismissed. Do you believe places can remember, even when people are desperate to forget? Because even though Miss Arlen managed to unravel this particular tangle of deceit, some secrets, perhaps the oldest and most dangerous ones, are the kind that a house learns to guard jealously. Can Hawthorne Manor ever truly find peace, or are there some stories that once disturbed, keep murmuring just beneath the surface, impossible to silence? I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you believe was the real curse tied to the emerald? Was it truly bound to the gem itself? Or was it always about the human hands that clutched at it out of greed, fear and ambition? And if you found yourself in Miss Arlen's shoes, standing in the middle of a house heavy with silence and unspoken sorrow. What would you have done differently? Let's keep the mystery alive. Share your theories in the comments. If you enjoyed this tale, and crave more classic mysteries steeped in secrets, twists and clever unravelings, make sure to subscribe, because around here the unknown is never far away. And if you know someone who loves a good old-fashioned whodunit, be sure to share this story with them. After all, mysteries are always sweeter when you have someone to puzzle them out with. Thank you for watching, and remember, every house has a story, but not every story is willing to be told. Some wait, patient and silent, for the right ears, and the right moment to reveal themselves.